Hello and welcome to this November 8th edition of the X106 podcast. We've been away the last couple of weeks. Had some health issues, some birthday celebrations, just all kinds of stuff that we've been away for. But we're back. It's November, and it's the X106 podcast. I'm Ryan Elliott, as always, and I'm joined, also as always, by Evan Brown.
That's right.
Evan, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. Ready to finally talk about some sports again.
Yeah, it's nice to be back, and this week we're going to do kind of a college show. We're going to take a look at some college football, the college football playoff rankings, which came out last night, I believe, and we'll also take a look at preseason, little preview of college basketball as that season starts to Friday, I guess. Not tomorrow, but Friday. So it's going to be a pretty solid show. I'm excited to see what we think of the upcoming college basketball season and continue the looks at this year's college football season. So let's get started with college football. We'll talk about the playoff rankings here. Came out last night, and the top four, Georgia, Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson in order. 5th, Oklahoma, 6th, TCU, 7th, Miami, 8th, Wisconsin, number 9, Washington, and number 10, Auburn. That rounds out your top 10. How close do you think, Evan, that this top four is to what we're going to see at the end of the season?
I think it's really close. If Oklahoma loses again, obviously they had the shootout against Oklahoma State. That defense still has not gotten any better. Their secondary has a lot of issues. Mason Rudolph, I believe, threw for 5 touchdowns, and he also did have 3 picks, but they got some issues to figure out, and if they want to make this college football playoff, they really got to hope for a loss by one of these, probably Notre Dame or Clemson. But in my opinion, I still see Alabama as that one. I feel like in the games to come, I think Georgia is not going to choke. They're not going to lose, but they're going to win a close game, and I think that's going to kind of put Alabama back in that one spot. So I think that I'd say the top 5 teams aren't going to move. There's going to be maybe some fluctuation with the 4 and 5. Other than that, I'd say those 5 teams all have a pretty equal chance of getting into the college football playoff.
I know a lot of people agree with you in the Alabama standpoint that I do think that they're a better team than Georgia at the moment. I think they've just blown out everybody, but the issue is with resume. Georgia's got a better resume at this point. They've beaten the number 3 team in these rankings. They took down Notre Dame on the road. Alabama's marquee win was Florida State, who at the beginning of the year that looked like a good win, but now Florida State's like 2-6, and it's just not that win doesn't look as good as it did at the beginning of the year. And I think now, just based solely off of resume, I think they've got it right with Georgia at 1 and Alabama at 2. Now, when they play each other inevitably in the SEC championship game, that's going to be a little bit different. And Georgia's got a big-time test this week. They could increase their number 1 resume if they beat Auburn this week. Since they take on Auburn, who's ranked number 10 in the college football playoff rankings. And I believe that game is at Jordan-Hare. So Jordan-Hare Stadium's not an easy place to play for anybody, especially the number 1 ranked team in the country coming in. If we remember, I don't think it was the last time, but a couple of times ago that the number 1 ranked team in the country came into Jordan-Hare Stadium, it was Alabama. And it ended in crazy fashion with Chris Davis returning a missed field goal for a touchdown to end the game in what came to be known as the kick 6. So they face a tough test this week. Alabama faces a tough test this week as well in Starkville at Mississippi State. So 2 tough tests for number 1 and 2. Notre Dame has a tough test this week as they go to Miami. So that game at Hard Rock Stadium in Miami, and that's a test for Notre Dame. They're number 3, Miami's number 7, and undefeated. I think if Miami wins this game, they could lock themselves up for the college football playoff at this point. And Notre Dame, they have to win out. They've still got a tough game against Stanford coming up as well on their schedule. And the one other game that I look at is the battle for control of the Big 12 is this week. You look at number 5 and number 6, Oklahoma takes on TCU in Norman. The winner of this game will then be the only hope for the Big 12 to get a team into the playoff.
Yeah,
and
you said it.
And that's what I look at in this Oklahoma TCU game. So we've got a lot of big-time matchups this week. We talked a little bit about Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, Mississippi State, Notre Dame, Miami, and then there's Clemson. Clemson takes on Florida State this week at home, and Florida State's not been good. But, Evan, do you look at this game a little bit and you see an 8-1 Clemson team taking on what is now a 3-5 Florida State team? Do the records are the records lying to you a little bit at the moment between these two teams?
I mean, it's no secret that Florida State has talent. It's just they just haven't found a way to put it together and mold so it's up to the Florida State standard. So I think the records are right. I mean, they have a good team. In the future, I mean, they're going to be ranked as soon as they get Francois back. They'll be right back up in, the argument for a top 15 team. Their defense is still good. They've been kind of getting just the wrong end of things, for lack of a better word. So, but I don't think that Clemson has any scares. They should not be scared going into this game. I think Florida State is a team that's kind of lost all of their how's the way to put it nicely? They don't have much confidence, I say, for the rest of the year. 3-5.
Yeah,
they're gonna have to fight for a bowl game, and it's just there's not a good chance of it. I think that Clemson's gonna just absolutely run away with this game. I mean, I'd like to think that Florida State has a chance, but I just don't see it.
Yeah.
So
let's take a look at what each of these. Let's go with maybe the top 7. What each of these top 7 teams, maybe 8 with Wisconsin, has left for their season. And when we get through with this, I want you to tell me which team you think has the easiest route to the playoff to finish the regular season undefeated, and which team you think has the most difficult route. Okay. So we'll start with Georgia. Left on their schedule, they're at Auburn, against Kentucky, at Georgia Tech, and then if they win all of those games, they'll play in the SEC championship game, more than likely against Alabama. Mm-hmm. If you look at Bama, they have at Mississippi State, at home against Mercer, and at Auburn. All right? That's the rest of their schedule. We talked about Clemson and having Florida State. They also have the Citadel and South Carolina left on their schedule. Both of those games are at home. Notre Dame, the third-ranked team, Miami, Navy, at Stanford. Okay. At Miami, at home against Navy, and at Stanford for the rest of their schedule. So that's the top 4. So let's start with the top 4. Which of those 4 teams do you think has the easiest route to finishing this season undefeated?
Alabama, obviously. I mean, let's just go back and look real quick. I already forgot. So they got Mississippi State. That's honestly, you could argue that's probably one of their biggest tests they've had, other than the LSU game, and then Florida State, as we mentioned earlier. I don't see them going into Mississippi State being a problem for Nick Saban and this Crimson Tide team. I think they'll handle them. I'm not sure that it'll be a blowout by any means, but that obviously that chance is there. Mercer, absolutely joke of a game. I'm sorry if you're a Mercer fan by some odd chance you're listening to this, but
that's the standard SEC Cupcake Week game.
Oh, for sure.
You play an FCS opponent the week before your big time rivalry.
Mm-hmm. And so then Auburn, obviously top 10 matchup there. That's going to be their only insane test. Wow, right before the SEC championship game.
Right.
So I'd say that's the easiest, just because of Alabama and what they've done over the past 5 years. I think they'd have absolutely the easiest route.
I think my team with the easiest route would be Clemson. You look at, they take on Florida State, they get them at home, which is big. Because if it was at Florida State, I think it would still be a very difficult game. But since they get Florida State at home, I think it makes things a little bit easier. Then they're at home against the Citadel, which is a game that they play every year. They've won something like 34 straight games against the Citadel. And so I have a feeling that streak's going to continue. And then at South Carolina to finish the season, which is another big rivalry, but South Carolina hasn't been great this year. So that's to me, 3 subpar teams to finish out their regular season. And that would be my easiest route to an undefeated regular season. Okay, so of those 4 teams, which team do you think has the toughest route to an undefeated regular season?
I'm going to say Notre Dame. They've got to go at Miami this next weekend. We've talked about the 3 versus 7 matchup. Miami doesn't play around. They've won umpteen thousand million close games this year and have really proved me wrong. I thought they were a joke, honestly. I mean, earlier on, we've been talking about college football in their past weeks. I did no chance. I would not have given them a chance to make it into the top 10 earlier on when we were talking. But now they're here. They've won a number of close games this year, and I'm really a Miami believer. If this game is, a 10-point game in the fourth quarter, I'll put my money on Miami. I'm just going to say that. But then, obviously you go to Navy, and then at Stanford, who isn't a joke of a team either. Bryce Love is, an immense kind of player. I think that one might give them some troubles. Other than that, though, I'd say they're my tough team.
I would agree with you that Notre Dame's probably got the toughest route. You mentioned at Miami, at home against Navy, at Stanford. Those are 3 difficult football games. Navy's a good football team. Stanford, as you mentioned, has Bryce Young. Miami's obviously the biggest test. And the question has been asked a number of times is, has the lack of affiliation with a conference hurt Notre Dame in the playoff rankings? And I think the obvious answer to that is no, because look at their schedule. They started the year against Temple. Okay, that's not a difficult game. Then they had Georgia at home, who's number 1 in the country at the moment, lost by a point. You look at Boston College, okay, that might be a layover game, but then at Michigan State. Michigan State right now has control of the Big Ten Conference.
They're ranked 12th, I believe.
Exactly. So Michigan State, that's at Michigan State. Okay, at home against Miami, Ohio, not great. At UNC, not great. But then at home against USC, that's a huge football game. USC was a big-time playoff contender at the time. At home against NC State, a team that threatened to take over the ACC from Clemson. At home against Wake Forest, but then at Miami, at Stanford, at home against Navy to end the year. I think this is the best schedule as far as overall strength of schedule in the country.
I agree. Absolutely. I mean, you wouldn't have thought that at the beginning of the year, and now just, things have changed up so much that this is one of the tougher schedules in college football.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. So there's the top 4. Let's move down to the next 4. Oklahoma, TCU, Miami, Wisconsin. Oklahoma has the rest of their schedule at home against TCU, at Kansas, at home against West Virginia. As for TCU, you look at Oklahoma, at Texas Tech, at home against Baylor. For Miami is obviously at home against Notre Dame, at home against Virginia, at Pittsburgh. And then Wisconsin, who may have had the easiest schedule of any Power 5 team, except for their next game, at home against Iowa, and then at home against Michigan, at Minnesota to finish the season. This is probably the toughest 3 games they've played all year as the stretch to end it. So of those 4 teams, which one of those has the easiest route to winning out and having a shot at the college football playoff?
Well, let me go ahead and click back on here. I forgot who I was going to click on. I'm going to go ahead. I believe it was TCU. I'm just going to jump on it. I'll say TCU. Other than the Oklahoma game, it's going to be a shootout. Every top 10 matchup we've had against a Big 12 team, it's been close or above 100 points scored total. I think this is another one of those games that could possibly be like that. I know that it is in Norman. But we saw what happened with Oklahoma State in Norman last week. We know that Oklahoma has a lot of defensive struggles, and you could argue the same for TCU as well. But I would almost argue that TCU has that second best defense in the Big 12, second to Iowa State. So I think that all the cards are falling in the right place for TCU to maybe get another upset against Oklahoma. Other than that, Texas Tech and Baylor, both pretty subpar teams this year, especially Baylor. So I'll give that to them. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt against Oklahoma, and then I'll say that.
I'm going to take Oklahoma. That has the easiest route because I think they've got an advantage being at home over TCU, and then their last two games are Kansas and West Virginia. Kansas is a Division II program at this point, and West Virginia has threatened some pretty good teams. They're 6-3 on the year, but I just don't think they're going to be any match for the Sooners. So I'm going to take Oklahoma in the easiest. So now the toughest route to the college football playoff.
Hold on, sorry.
And there's so many similar. The issue here is that there's so many similar ends to the season. Everybody's got a big matchup this weekend. These four teams.
That's
Oklahoma plays TCU. Miami plays Notre Dame. Wisconsin is playing Iowa. So there's a tough matchup everywhere this week at least.
I don't know if I'm going to say toughest or most potential for a loss, and. If I say most potential for a loss, I'm going to go to the Wisconsin Badgers. They've got to play Iowa, who showed that they're pretty for real against a pretty good Ohio State team last week, just throttling them. So they are home against Iowa. That's the only thing that kind of held me back from picking Wisconsin. But I think Iowa's going to come in here with so much momentum, and I think they're really going to give Wisconsin a run for their money because we mentioned that, they haven't played a ranked opponent, if I'm not mistaken, all year.
They haven't.
Yeah. So, here they are against number 20 Iowa. They do have 3 losses, but you see that, they absolutely throttled Ohio State. And right after that, they have to play another team who was ranked earlier in the season in Michigan. They've got probably one of the most scary front fours in defense. Honestly, I'm just going to go ahead and say that. Even though they are unranked, their defense has been pretty good all year. So that's not a cupcake matchup by any means. And then they're at Minnesota to end it out. So I think those first 2 games, Iowa and Michigan, are going to give them the most trouble. But, I wouldn't sleep on Minnesota either.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that Wisconsin, I think, has the toughest route just because they're playing their last 3 games of the season are the 3 toughest games that they'll play all year. If you look at the rest of their schedule, maybe at home against Northwestern is the only other game that I look at and see as maybe being a little bit difficult. But outside of that, they managed to miss the top 3 teams in the Big Ten East. Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State.
Yeah.
They didn't play any of them. And that's, I think, the biggest reason why, at the moment, Wisconsin is the only hope for the Big Ten to find a place in the college football playoff. I think if you look at Wisconsin compared to the top 4 teams, they may have a better chance of going undefeated, except for maybe Clemson. But if Wisconsin goes undefeated and they win the Big Ten championship game, which will at the moment be against Michigan State, then I think you have to look at that as I think they've got to be in. If they go undefeated and they win the Big Ten, I think they have to be in.
Yeah.
But if they stumble against Iowa this week, or if they stumble in the Big Ten championship game, the Big Ten will not get a team in the playoff.
I agree. I believe I saw that Big Ten has 34% chance of getting a team in there or something. 35,
22,
21. Wow.
The Independents have a better chance thanks to Notre Dame. Than the Big Ten does. The Big Ten has a 22% chance, and the Pac-12 is even less than that. As we take a look. The percentage that they are giving for each conference to find their way in. We've got the SEC at 99.7% because one of the two, Alabama or Georgia, is going to get in. Even with one loss. If both teams have one loss at the end of the season, I think one of them gets in. The ACC at 86.8% with both Clemson and Miami having a shot to get in there. The Big 12 at 72.2%. They need either Oklahoma or TCU to finish out the season with one loss, whoever wins that game. FBS Independence, obviously, with Notre Dame at 36%. The Big 10 at 22%, and then the Pac-12 at just 4%. Washington's really their only chance, and Washington hasn't played a good enough schedule this year to really get in. So I don't think that Washington's got much of an opportunity to get in, so I don't think the Pac-12 will get one in. This could be the first year that we've seen only 2 Power 5 conferences get a team into the playoffs.
It's crazy.
Because we could have 2 teams from the SEC. I think Alabama and Georgia. If they both finish the season with 1 loss, I think they could both make it in. So that's an option. Or if one of them finishes undefeated and one of them has 1 loss, that they could both be in. So you could have 2 teams from the SEC, and then either Clemson or the winner of the Big 12 and Notre Dame.
Yep.
Then you only have 2 Power 5 conferences in there: the Big 10, the Pac-12. And either the ACC or the Big 12 gets left out in that situation. That could be huge.
Crazy to think.
Huge.
Yeah.
And I think that is what would propel the committee to stretch it to 8 teams instead of 4.
Oh, I'd love 8 teams. It'd be awesome.
I think if you only have 2 Power 5 conference teams in there, or 2 Power 5 conferences represented in the college football playoff, I think that would be what propels the committee to switch to 8.
It'd be so cool. I'm just sitting here thinking about it. It'd be awesome. I mean, right now, look at those 8 teams. Georgia, Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, Oklahoma, TCU, Miami, Wisconsin.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
That would be so cool.
And your 7 and 8 seeds would both be undefeated.
Yeah. Crazy stuff.
That's just one thing that you look at. So real quick, give me your favorite for Heisman.
Oh, man. I think his name is Baker Mayfield, I think. Yeah, he's been tearing it up all year. Saquon Barkley kind of has, had mediocre games in his last couple, so I think it hurts his stock a lot. Bryce Love, he's been doing his thing all year, but being on that Stanford team, I can't see him, taking the cake. I got to give it to Baker Mayfield.
Here's the deal. Bryce Love had a terrible game last week at Washington State. Saquon Barkley had a terrible game last week, or not Washington State, excuse me. Yes, they did play Washington State last week. Never mind. Don't mind me. Saquon Barkley had a terrible game at Michigan State last week. This is Baker Mayfield's Heisman to lose.
Yep.
At this point. 598 passing yards and 5 touchdowns on 66% completions at Oklahoma State last week. He gets TCU. He could last week, I think, was that big Heisman moment that you look for in a player, and single-handedly beating an Oklahoma State team that at the time was ranked, I think, 11th is I think your Heisman moment, and I think he's got a chance to do that again this week against TCU. So I think it's his Heisman to lose right now in the ESPN experts poll that they have on ESPN.com. He has all 12 first-place votes.
He deserves every single one.
And so, yeah, I think it's Mayfield's to lose right now. If for some reason he goes into TCU and throws like 6 interceptions, then I think
Barrett did.
Then I think Bryce Love could jump up there, just because he's got a bajillion rushing yards. But outside of that, it's got to be Baker Mayfield at this point. I think that's going to wrap up our talk of college football.
Absolutely.
We're going to move on to college basketball here as you're listening to the X106 podcast. I think we'll make this kind of a short discussion, but we are getting excited for college basketball as the season starts on Friday, officially, with the first Division I versus Division I matchups, and we've got a pretty big one right off the bat on Friday. In fact, there's a couple of them. And I think the first one that's occurring during the day is number 9 North Carolina at home against Northern Iowa. Excuse me. No. I skipped one, and a very important one. Number 11 West Virginia and number 25 Texas A&M.
Yeah. Oh boy.
At an Air Force base in Germany. That's a big-time matchup for the first day of college basketball. Texas A&M, an improved team out of the SEC. West Virginia always threatening to knock Kansas's crown off in the Big 12. That's going to be a big-time matchup to start. That's at 5 o'clock. It's on ESPN. That, again, is on Friday. And then The other matchup is number 9 North Carolina at home against Northern Iowa. Northern Iowa, in their history, has been known as a giant killer.
Yeah.
Northern Iowa has a very, very big reputation as a giant killer. How, if you had to give a ballpark percentage, what sort of chance do you think Northern Iowa has in this basketball game?
I'll give them 27%.
That's very specific. I like it.
Yeah. I was going to go 25, but I just kind of felt that wasn't enough. So
that's fine with me.
27. I'll stick with
27%. I tend to agree with you that's in the ballpark of what I would consider as well, because UNI, as we mentioned, is known as a giant killer. That's their reputation, and North Carolina certainly is a giant. So that could be something to watch. Another couple interesting matchups. South Carolina, last year a Final Four team. They travel to Wofford to start the season. That's something you don't see very often, is a big-time program going to kind of a smaller program to play a game. That's at Jerry Richardson Indoor Stadium in Spartanburg, Virginia. And the other big-time game occurring on Friday, as many fans around this area will be excited about, is the currently unranked but receiving votes Missouri Tigers are at home at Mizzou Arena for the first time on the year, and they will be taking on Iowa State. So let's talk just a minute about that matchup. Mizzou, Iowa State at Mizzou Arena. Mizzou, of course, with freshman upon freshman upon freshman. As we take a look at their roster, of course, it includes Michael Porter Jr., it includes his brother Jonte. You also see C.J. Roberts, a freshman from Irving, Texas. He's a guard. Terrence Phillips last year played point guard a lot. You look at, of course, Jonte Michael Porter. You see Jeremiah Tillman, a 6'10" big man from East St. Louis. Kevin Puryear got a lot of playing time last year. This is a big-time roster with a lot of big-time players that could potentially take this Missouri team over the top. And when I say over the top, I mean more than 8 wins, because they finished with 8 wins last year.
Yeah.
Over the top for this Missouri team at the moment would be making the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
And I think it's certainly possible. They've got a lot of talent on that roster. We talk a little bit about what happened at the Sprint Center on, I believe, was October 22nd, as Missouri and Kansas played in an exhibition, and I put that in air quotes because both of those teams treated like it was a regular season game.
Absolutely.
But they played an exhibition at the Sprint Center, and Mizzou competed. Mizzou competed really well with a Kansas team that's just as good as they always are. They're ranked number 4 in the preseason poll at the moment. I think they've obviously have the best odds to win what I believe will be their 13th consecutive Big 12 championship. And Mizzou competed. Now, they were down 17 with 5 minutes left in the second half, and I think starters on starters, Kansas had a pretty hefty advantage. But what else can you expect? It's a team full of freshmen playing against one of the more experienced Kansas teams that we've seen in a long time, with Devontae Graham leading that charge as, I think, a favorite for the Big 12 Player of the Year. So Missouri had a tough test to start their exhibition season, but they competed, and they looked like a team that could potentially make the NCAA tournament. However, they have Iowa State as their first game of the year, and if we know anything about Iowa State, it's that they're going to shoot a lot of threes. They're going to put up a lot of threes, and if they're on, they could potentially run anybody off the floor.
And they always have 1 or 2 aggressive rebounders, and they may not have that offensive resume that you'd like to see, but all they do out there is be aggressive on defense, be aggressive on the boards. They always have talent. I mean, you can't just look at the Iowa State team and just be like, we'll probably win, because there's always a chance that Iowa State's going to upset you. I mean, we've seen it time and time again in the Big 12 in the past 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
So
here's what they lose, however. Iowa State is not returning Monte Morris. They're not returning Naz Long. They're not returning Deontay Burton. They're not returning Matt Thomas. Those were their 4 top scorers last year. That's going to be big, as they're going to have to rely a lot on Donovan Jackson, a senior guard from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that was their 5th leading scorer last year. He did, however, he shot 45% from three-point, and that's going to be the big. In fact, from a percentage standpoint, he was their best three-point shooter. So, you look at this team that's lost a lot. They lose their top 4 scorers. You think, okay, this should be an easy basketball game. But as I mentioned, and as we talked about, this Iowa State team has a way that they play the game that can run you absolutely out of the arena if they are on.
They're going to push the pace against a Mizzou team.
They're going to push the pace, and they're going to put up a lot of three-pointers. And if those three-pointers are going in, it's going to be hard to keep up. But at the same time, we've seen this Iowa State team, if they're cold, they can lose to some really bad basketball teams.
Yeah.
And if they're cold and they're playing a good basketball team, who knows what the deficit could be. We're talking 40 plus if they can't shoot the basketball. So it just depends on which Iowa State team that Mizzou gets to start the year. But I think if they get through Iowa State, their next game is, I believe, at home against Wagner. So they've got a bit of a simpler game there at home against Wagner. So if they can beat Iowa State, they continue at home and beat Wagner, then they've got Utah later in the week. I think if they win those first 3 games, then they will enter the top 25.
I think that's a good number to give them. I think those 3.
Because number 25, Texas A&M, is on a neutral court against West Virginia.
That's right.
And that's a team that is very, very dangerous, and I think is going to beat Texas A&M. That moves number 25 out of the rankings and will probably move Missouri in if they can beat Iowa State. So a bright spot for Missouri Tiger fans after a couple of years of just disappointing basketball, to say the least. The Missouri basketball program's back on track. So that'll be interesting to watch all season long. And as we take a real quick look at the preseason top 25, we have, of course, Duke number 1, Michigan State number 2, Arizona 3, Kansas 4, and Kentucky 5. Those are your top 5 in the AP. Just a few changes. Kansas at 3, Kentucky at 4, Arizona at 5 in the USA Today coaches poll. Duke and Michigan State still 1 and 2. This is a year where, Duke's the favorite by a long shot, but it's a team full of freshmen. I think outside of that, Michigan State, Arizona, Kansas, Kentucky, Villanova, Wichita State, Florida, North Carolina, USC, West Virginia, I think all of those teams have a chance. And when we get to tournament time, who knows what we're going to see. There's a long season ahead of us, and it's going to be a fun year in college basketball.
I'm excited. I'm real excited. And it all starts Friday.
Yep. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday is kind of the big area for college football to start the season. And then the next week we're going to start seeing the preseason tournaments get kicked off and everything gets going with college basketball. And an exciting time in sports today. As I believe that's going to wrap up our discussion today on the X106 podcast. I've been Ryan Elliott. I was joined today, as always, by Evan Brown. Thanks for joining me, Evan.
Of course.
And we will see you next time on the X106 podcast.